Human Nature and Conduct by John Dewey, Part 2 of 4, The Place of Impulse in Conduct. Section 1, Impulses and Change of Habits. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by William Jones. Section 1, Impulses and Change of Habits.
Habits as organized activities are secondary and acquired, not native and original. They are outgrowths of unlearned activities which are part of man's endowment at birth. The order of topics followed in our discussion here may accordingly be questioned. Why should what is derived, and therefore in some sense artificial in conduct, be discussed before what is primitive, natural, and inevitable? Why didn't we not set out with an examination of those instinctive activities upon which the acquisition of habits is conditioned? The query is a natural one, yet attempts to fling forth a paradox. In conduct, the acquired is the primitive. Impulses, although first in time, are never primary in fact. They are secondary and dependent. The seeming paradox in statement covers a familiar fact. In the life of the individual, instinctive activity comes first. But an individual begins life as a baby, and babies are dependent beings. Their activities could continue at most for only a few hours, were it not for the presence and aid of adults with their formed habits. And babies owe to adults more than procreation, more than the continued food and protection which preserve life. They owe to adults the opportunity to express their native activities in ways that have meaning. Even if, by some miracle, original activity could continue without assistance from the organized skill and art of adults, it would not amount to anything. It would be mere sound and fury. In short, the meaning of native activities is not native. It is acquired. It depends upon interaction with a matured social medium. In the case of a tiger or eagle, anger may be identified with a serviceable life activity, with attack and defense. With a human being, it is as meaningless as a gust of wind on a mud puddle, apart from a direction given it by the presence of other persons, apart from the responses they make to it. It is a physical spasm, a blind, dispersive burst of wasteful energy. It gets quality, significance, when it becomes a smoldering sullenness, an annoying interruption, a peevish irritation, a murderous revenge, a blazing indignation. And although these phenomena which have a meaning spring from original native reactions to stimuli, yet they depend also upon the responsive behavior of others. They and all similar human displays of anger are not pure impulses. They are habits formed under the influence of association with others who have habits already, and who show their habits in the treatment which converts a blind physical discharge into a significant anger. After ignoring impulses for a long time in behalf of sensations, modern psychology now tends to start out with an inventory and description of instinctive activities. This is an undoubted improvement. But when it tries to explain complicated events in personal and social life by direct reference to these native powers, the explanation becomes hazy and forced. It is like saying the flea and the elephant, the lichen and the redwood, the timid hare and the ravening wolf, the plant with the most inconspicuous blossom and the plant with the most glaring color are alike products of natural selection. There may be a sense in which this statement is true, but till we know the specific environing conditions under which selection took place, we really know nothing. And so we need to know about the social conditions which have educated original activities into definite and significant dispositions before we can discuss the psychological element in society. This is the true meaning of social psychology. At some place on the globe, at some time, every kind of practice seems to have been tolerated or even praised. How is the tremendous diversity of institutions, including moral codes, to be accounted for? The native stock of instincts is practically the same everywhere. Exaggerate as much as we like the native differences of Patagonians and Greeks, Sioux Indians and Hindus, Bushmen and Chinese, the original differences will bear no comparison to the amount of difference found in custom and culture. Since such a diversity cannot be attributed to an original identity, the development of native impulse must be stated in terms of acquired habits, not the growth of customs in terms of instincts. The wholesale human sacrifices of Peru and their tenderness of St. Francis, the cruelties of pirates and the philanthropies of Howard, the practice of Sati and the cult of the Virgin, the war and peace dances of the Comanches and the parliamentary institutions of the British, the communism of the South Sea Islander, and the proprietary thrift of the Yankee, the magic of the medicine man and the experiments of the chemist in his laboratory, the non-resistance of Chinese and the aggressive militarism of an imperial Prussia, monarchy by divine right and government by the people, the countless diversity of habits suggested by such a random list springs from practically the same capital stock of native instincts. It would be pleasant if we could pick and choose those institutions which we like and impute them to human nature, and the rest to some devil, or those we like to our own kind of human nature, and those we dislike to the nature of despised foreigners on the ground they are not really native at all. It would appear to be simpler if we could point to certain customs, saying that they are the unalloyed products of certain instincts, while those other social arrangements are to be attributed wholly to other impulses. But such methods are not feasible. The same original fears, angers, loves, and hates are hopelessly entangled in the most opposite institutions. The thing we need to know is how a native stock has been modified by interaction with different environments. Yet it goes without saying that original, unlearned activity has its distinctive place, and that an important one in conduct. Impulses are the pivots upon which the reorganization of activities turn. They are agencies of deviation, for giving new directions to old habits and changing their quality. Consequently, whenever we are concerned with understanding social transition and flux, or with projects for reform, personal or collective, our study must go to analysis of native tendencies. Interest in progress and reform is, indeed, the reason for the present great development of scientific interest in primitive human nature. If we inquire why men were so long blind to the existence of powerful and varied instincts in human beings, the answer seems to be found in the lack of a conception of orderly progress. It is fast becoming incredible that psychologists disputed as to whether they should choose between innate ideas and an empty, passive, wax-like mind. For it seems as if a glance at a child would have revealed that the truth lay in neither doctrine. So obvious is the surging of specific native activities. But this obtuseness to facts was evidence of lack of interest in what could be done with impulses, due, in turn, to lack of interest in modifying existing institutions. It is no accident that men become interested in the psychology of savages and babies when they become interested in doing away with old institutions. A combination of traditional individualism with the recent interest in progress explains why the discovery of the scope and force of instincts has led many psychologists to think of them as the fountainhead of all conduct, as occupying a place before instead of after that of habits. The orthodox tradition in psychology is built upon isolation of individuals from their surroundings. The soul or mind or consciousness was thought of as self-contained and self-enclosed. Now, in the career of an individual, if it is regarded as complete in itself, instincts clearly come before habits. Generalize this individualistic view, and we have an assumption that all customs, all significant episodes in the life of individuals, can be carried directly back to the operation of instincts. But as we have already noted, if an individual be isolated in this fashion, along with the fact of primacy of instinct, we find also the fact of death. The inchoate and scattered impulses of an infant do not coordinate into serviceable powers except through social dependencies and companionships. His impulses are merely starting points for assimilation of the knowledge and skill of the more matured beings upon whom he depends. They are tentacles set out to gather that nutrition from customs which will in time render the infant capable of independent action. They are agencies for transfer of existing social power into personal ability. They are means of reconstructive growth. Abandon an impossible individualistic psychology, and we arrive at the fact that native activities are organs of reorganization and readjustment. The hen precedes the egg, but nevertheless, this particular egg
may be so treated as to modify the future type of hen. End of section 1. Human Nature and Conduct by John Dewey, Part 2 of 4, The Place of Impulse in Conduct. Section 2, Plasticity of Impulse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by William Jones.
In the case of the young, it is patent that impulses are highly flexible starting points for activities which are diversified according to the ways in which they are used. Any impulse may become organized into almost any disposition according to the way it interacts with surroundings. Fear may become abject cowardice, prudent caution, reverence for superiors, or respect for equals. An agency for credulous swallowing of absurd superstitions or for wary skepticism. A man may be chiefly afraid of the spirits of his ancestors, of officials, of arousing the disapproval of his associates, of being deceived, of fresh air, or of Bolshevism. The actual outcome depends on how the impulse of fear is interwoven with other impulses. This depends, in turn, upon the outlets and inhibitions supplied by the social environment. In a definite sense, then, a human society is always starting afresh. It is always in process of renewing, and it endures only because of renewal. We speak of the peoples of Southern Europe as Latin peoples. Their existing languages depart widely from one another and from the Latin mother tongue. Yet there never was a day when this alteration of speech was intentional or explicit. Persons always meant to reproduce the speech they heard from their elders and suppose they were succeeding. This fact may stand as a kind of symbol of the reconstruction wrought in habits because of the fact that they can be transmitted and be made to endure only through the medium of the crude activities of the young or through contact with persons having different habits. For the most part, this continuous alteration has been unconscious and unintended. Immature, undeveloped activity has succeeded in modifying adult organized activity accidentally and surreptitiously. But with the dawn of the idea of progressive betterment and an interest in new uses of impulses, there has grown up some unconsciousness of the extent to which a future new society of changed purposes and desires may be created by a deliberate humane treatment of the impulses of youth. This is the meaning of education. For a truly humane education consists in an intelligent direction of native activities in the light of the possibilities and necessities of the social situation. But for the most part, adults have given training rather than education. An impatient, premature mechanization of impulsive activity after the fixed pattern of adult habits of thought and affection has been desired. The combined effect of love of power, timidity in the face of the novel, and a self-admiring complacency has been too strong to permit immature impulse to exercise its reorganizing potentialities. The younger generation has hardly even knocked frankly at the door of adult customs, much less been invited in to rectify, through better education, the brutalities and inequities established in adult habits. Each new generation has crept blindly and furtively through such chance gaps as have happened to be left open. Otherwise, it has been modeled after the old. We have already noted how original plasticity is warped and docility is taken mean advantage of. It has been used to signify not capacity to learn liberally and generously, but willingness to learn the custom of adult associates, ability to learn just those special things which those having power and authority wish to teach. Original modifiability has not been given a fair chance to act as a trustee for a better human life. It has been loaded with convention, biased by adult convenience. It has been practically rendered into an equivalent of non-assertion of originality, a pliant accommodation to the embodied opinions of others. Consequently, docility has been identified with imitativeness instead of with power to remake old habits, to recreate. Plasticity and originality have been opposed to each other. That the most precious part of plasticity consists in ability to form habits of independent judgment and of inventive initiation has been ignored, for it demands a more complete and intense docility to form flexible, easily readjusted habits than it does to acquire those which rigidly copy the ways of others. In short, among the native activities of the young are some that work towards accommodation, assimilation, and reproduction, and others that work toward exploration, discovery, and creation. But the weight of adult custom has been thrown upon retaining and strengthening tendencies toward conformity, and against those which make for variation and independence. The habits of the growing person are jealously kept within the limit of adult customs. The delightful originality of the child is tamed. Worship of institutions and personages themselves, lacking in imaginative foresight, versatile observation, and liberal thought, is enforced. Very early in life, sets of mind are formed without attentive thought, and these sets persist and control the mature mind. The child learns to avoid the shock of unpleasant disagreement, to find the easy way out, to appear to conform to customs which are wholly mysterious to him in order to get his own way. That is, to display some natural impulse without exciting the unfavorable notice of those in authority. Adults distrust the intelligence which a child has while making upon him demands for a kind of conduct that requires a high order of intelligence if it is to be intelligent at all. The inconsistency is reconciled by instilling in him moral habits which have a maximum of emotional impressment and adamantine hold with a minimum of understanding. These habitudes, deeply ingrained before thought is awake, and even before the day of experiences which can later be recalled, govern conscious later thought. They are usually deepest and most unget-at-able
just where critical thought is most needed, in morals,
religion, and politics. These infantilisms account for the mass of irrationalities that prevail among men of otherwise rational taste. These personal hangovers are the cause of what the student of culture calls survivals. But unfortunately, these survivals are much more numerous and pervasive than the anthropologists and historians are wont to admit. To list them would perhaps oust one from respectable society. And yet, the intimation never wholly deserts us that there is in the unformed activities of childhood and youth the possibilities of a better life for the community as well as for individuals here and there. This dim sense is the ground of our abiding idealization of childhood. For with all its extravagancies and uncertainties, its effusions and reticences, it remains a standing proof of a life wherein growth is normal, not an anomaly, activity a delight and not a task, and where habit forming is an expansion of power, not its shrinkage. Habit and impulse may war with one another, but it is a combat between the habits of adults and the impulses of the young, and not, as with the adult, a civil warfare whereby personality is rent asunder. Our usual measure for the goodness of children is the amount of trouble they make for grown-ups, which means, of course, the amount they deviate from adult habits and expectations. Yet, by way of expiation, we envy children their love of new experiences, their intentness in extracting the last drop of significance from each situation, and their vital seriousness in things that to us are outworn. We compensate for the harshness and monotony of our present insistence upon formed habits by imagining a future heaven in which we too shall respond freshly and generously to each incident of life. In consequence of our divided attitude, Our ideals are self-contradictory. On the one hand, we dream of an attained perfection, an ultimate static goal in which effort shall cease and desire and execution be once and for all in complete equilibrium. We wish for a character which shall be steadfast, and we then conceive this desired faithfulness as something immutable, a character exactly the same yesterday, today, and forever. But we also have a sneaking sympathy for the courage of an Emerson in declaring that consistency should be thrown to the winds when it stands between us and the opportunities of present life. We reach out to the opposite extreme of our ideal of fixity, and under the guise of a return to nature, dream of a romantic freedom in which all life is plastic to impulse, a continual source of improvised spontaneities and novel inspirations. We rebel against all organization and all stability. If modern thought and sentiment is to escape from this division in its ideals, it must be through utilizing released impulse as an agent of steady reorganization of custom and institutions. While childhood is the conspicuous proof of the renewing of habit rendered possible by impulse, the latter never wholly ceases to play its refreshing role in adult life. If it did, life would petrify, society stagnate. Instinctive reactions are sometimes too intense to be woven into a smooth pattern of habits. Under ordinary circumstances, they appear to be tamed to obey their master, custom. But extraordinary crises release them, and they show by wild and violent energy how superficial is the control of routine. The saying that civilization is only skin deep, that a savage persists beneath the clothes of a civilized man, is the common acknowledgment of this fact. At critical moments of unusual stimuli, the emotional outbreak and rush of instincts dominating all activity show how superficial is the modification which a rigid habit has been able to effect. When we face this fact in its general significance, we confront one of the ominous aspects of the history of man. We realize how little the progress of man has been the product of intelligent guidance, how largely it has been a byproduct of accidental upheavals, even though by an apologetic interest in behalf of some privileged institution we later transmute chance into providence. We have depended upon the clash of war, the stress of revolution, the emergence of heroic individuals, the impact of migrations generated by war and famine, the incoming of barbarians, to change established institutions. Instead of constantly utilizing unused impulse to effect continuous reconstruction, we have waited till an accumulation of stresses suddenly breaks through the dikes of custom. It is often supposed that as old persons die, so must old peoples. There are many facts in history to support the belief. Decadence and degeneration seem to be the rule as age increases. An eruption of some uncivilized horde has then provided new blood and fresh life, so much so that history has been defined as a process of re-barbarization. In truth, the analogy between a person and a nation with respect to senescence and death is defective. A nation is always renewed by the death of its old constituents and the birth of those who are as young and fresh as ever were any individuals in the heyday of the nation's glory. Not the nation, but its customs get old. Its institutions petrify into rigidity through social arterial sclerosis. Then some people, not overburdened with elaborate and stiff habits, take up and carry on the moving process of life. The stock of fresh peoples is, however, approaching exhaustion. It is not safe to rely upon this expensive method of renewing civilization. We need to discover how to rejuvenate it from within. A normal perpetuation becomes a fact in the degree in which impulse is released and habit is plastic to the transforming touch of impulse. When customs are flexible and youth is educated as youth and not as premature adulthood, no nation grows old. There always exists a goodly store of non-functioning impulses which may be drawn upon. Their manifestation and utilization is called conversion or regeneration when it comes suddenly. But they may be drawn upon continuously and moderately. Then we call it learning or educative growth. Rigid custom signifies not that there are no such impulses, but that they are not organically taken advantage of. As a matter of fact, the stiffer and the more encrusted the customs, the larger is the number of instinctive activities that find no regular output and that accordingly merely wait a chance to get an irregular, uncoordinated manifestation. Routine habits never take up all the slack. They apply only where conditions remain the same or recur in uniform ways. They do not fit the unusual and novel. Consequently, rigid moral codes that attempt to lay down definite injunctions and prohibitions for every occasion in life turn out, in fact, loose and slack. Stretch 10 Commandments or any other number as far as you will by ingenious exegesis, yet acts unprovided for by them will occur. No elaboration of statute law can forestall variant cases and the need of interpretation ad hoc. Moral and legal schemes that attempt the impossible in the way of definite formulation compensate for explicit strictness in some lines by implicit looseness in others. The only truly severe code is the one which forgoes codification, throwing responsibility for judging each case upon the agents concerned, imposing on them the burden of discovery and adaptation. The relation which actually exists between undirected instinct and over-organized custom is illustrated in the two views that are current about savage life. The popular view looks at the savage as a wild man, as one who knows no controlling principles or rules of action, who freely follows his own impulse, whim, or desire whenever it seizes him and wherever it takes him. Anthropologists are given to the opposed notion. They view savages as bondsmen to custom. They note the network of regulations that order his risings up and his sittings down, his goings out and his comings in. They conclude that in comparison with civilized man, the savage is a slave, governed by many inflexible tribal habitudes in conduct and ideas. The truth about savage life lies in a combination of these two conceptions. Where customs exist, they are of one pattern and binding on personal sentiment and thought to a degree unknown in civilized life. But since they cannot possibly exist with respect to all the changing detail of daily life, whatever is left uncovered by custom is free from regulation. It is therefore left to appetite and momentary circumstance. Thus, enslavement to custom and license of impulse exist side by side. Strict conformity and unrestrained wildness intensify each other. This picture of life shows us in an exaggerated form the psychology current in civilized life whenever customs harden and hold individuals enmeshed. Within civilization, the savage still exists. He is known in his degree by oscillation between loose indulgence and stiff habit. Impulse, in short, brings with itself the possibility, but not the assurance, of a steady reorganization of habits to meet new elements in new situations. The moral problem, in child and adult alike, as regards impulse and instinct, is to utilize them for formation of new habits, or, what is the same thing, the modification of an old habit so that it may be adequately serviceable under novel conditions. The place of impulse in conduct, as pivot of readjustment, reorganization in habits, may be defined as follows. On one side, it is marked off from the territory of arrested and encrusted habits. On the other side, it is demarcated from the region in which impulse is a law unto itself. Generalizing these distinctions, a valid moral theory contrasts with all those theories which set up static goals, even when they are called perfection, and with those theories which idealize raw impulse and find in its spontaneities an adequate code of human freedom. Impulse is a source, an indispensable source of liberation, but only as it is employed in giving habits pertinence and freshness does it liberate power. Begin footnote 5. The use of the words instinct and impulse as practical equivalents is intentional, even though it may grieve critical readers. The word instinct, taken alone, is still too laden with the older notion that an instinct is always definitely organized and adapted, which for the most part is just what it is not in human beings. The word impulse suggests something primitive, yet loose, undirected, and initial. Man can progress as beasts cannot, precisely because he has so many instincts that they cut across one another, so that most serviceable actions must be learned. In learning habits, it is possible for man to learn the habit of learning. Then betterment becomes a conscious principle in life. End of footnote.
End of section 2. Human Nature and Conduct by John Dewey. Part 2 of 4, The Place of Impulse in Conduct. Section 3, Changing Human Nature. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by William Jones.
Incidentally, we have touched upon a most far-reaching problem, the alterability of human nature. Early reformers, following John Locke, were inclined to minimize the significance of native activities and to emphasize the possibilities inherent in practice and habit acquisition. There was a political slant to this denial of the native and a priori, this magnifying of the accomplishments of acquired experience. It held out a prospect of continuous development, of improvement without end. Thus, writers like Helvetius
Made the idea of the complete malleability of a human nature,
which originally is wholly empty and passive, the basis for asserting the omnipotence of education to shape human society, and the ground of proclaiming the infinite perfectibility of mankind. Wary, experienced men of the world have always been skeptical of schemes of unlimited improvement. They tend to regard plans for social change
with an eye of suspicion.
They find in them evidences of the proneness of youth to illusion, or of incapacity on the part of those who have grown old to learn anything from experience. This type of conservative has thought to find in the doctrine of native instincts a scientific support for asserting the practical unalterability of human nature. Circumstances may change, but human nature remains from age to age the same. Heredity is more potent than environment, and human heredity is untouched by human intent. Effort for a serious alteration of human institutions is utopian. As things have been, so they will be. The more they change, the more they remain the same. Curiously enough, both parties rest their case upon just the factor which, it is analyzed, weakens their respective conclusions. That is to say, the radical reformer rests his contention in behalf of easy and rapid change upon the psychology of habits, of institutions in shaping raw nature, and the conservative grounds his counter-assertion upon the psychology of instincts. As a matter of fact, it is precisely custom which has greatest inertia, which is least susceptible of alteration,
while instincts are most readily modifiable through use,
most subject to educative direction. The conservative, who begs scientific support from the psychology of instincts, is the victim of an outgrown psychology which derived its notion of instinct from an exaggeration of the fixity and certainty of the operation of instincts among the lower animals. He is a victim of a popular zoology of the bird, bee, and beaver, which was largely framed to the greater glory of God. He is ignorant that instincts in the animals are less infallible and definite than is supposed, and also that the human being differs from the lower animals in precisely the fact that his native activities lack the complex, ready-made organization of the animal's original abilities. But the shortcut revolutionist fails to realize the full force of the things about which he talks most, namely, institutions as embodied habits. Anyone with knowledge of the stability and force of habit will hesitate to propose or prophesy rapid and sweeping social changes. A social revolution may effect abrupt and deep alterations in external customs, in legal and political institutions, but the habits that are behind these institutions and that have willy-nilly been shaped by objective conditions, the habits of thought and feeling, are not so easily modified. They persist and insensibly assimilate to themselves the outer innovations, much as American judges nullify the intended changes of statute law by interpreting legislation in the light of common law. The force of lag in human life is enormous. Actual social change is never so great as is apparent change. Ways of belief, of expectation, of judgment, and attendant emotional dispositions of like and dislike are not easily modified after they have once taken shape. Political and legal institutions may be altered, even abolished, but the bulk of popular thought, which has been shaped to their pattern, persists. This is why glowing predictions of the immediate coming of a social millennium terminate so uniformly in disappointment, which gives point to the standing suspicion of the cynical conservative about radical changes. Habits of thought outlive modifications in the habit of overt action. The former are vital, the latter, without the sustaining life of the former, are muscular tricks. Consequently, as a rule, the moral effects of even great political revolutions, after a few years of outwardly conspicuous alterations, do not show themselves till after the lapse of years. A new generation must come upon the scene whose habits of mind have been formed under the new conditions. There is pith in the saying that important reforms cannot take real effect
until after a number of influential persons have died.
Where general and enduring moral changes do accompany an external revolution, it is because appropriate habits of thought have previously been insensibly matured. The external change merely registers the removal of an external superficial barrier to the operation of existing intellectual tendencies. Those who argue that social and moral reform is impossible on the ground that the old Adam of human nature remains forever the same, attribute, however, to native activities the permanence and inertia that in truth belong only to acquired customs. To Aristotle, slavery was rooted in aboriginal human nature. Native distinctions of quality exist such that some persons are, by nature, gifted with power to plan, command, and supervise, and others possess merely capacity to obey and execute. Hence, slavery is natural and inevitable. There is error in supposing that because domestic and chattel slavery has been legally abolished, therefore slavery as conceived by Aristotle has disappeared. But matters have at last progressed to a point where it is clear that slavery is a social state, not a psychological necessity. Nevertheless, the worldly wise Aristotles of today assert that the institutions of war and the present wage system are so grounded in immutable human nature that effort to change them is foolish. Like Greek slavery or feudal serfdom, war and the existing economic regime are social patterns wove out of the stuff of instinctive activities. Native human nature supplies the raw materials, but custom furnishes the machinery and the designs. War would not be possible without anger, pugnacity, rivalry, self-display, and such like native tendencies. Activity inheres in them and will persist under every condition of life. To imagine they can be eradicated is like supposing that society can go on without eating and without union of the sexes. But to fancy that they must eventuate in war is as if a savage were to believe that because he uses fibers having fixed natural properties in order to weave baskets, therefore his immemorial tribal patterns are also natural necessities and immutable forms. From a humane standpoint, our study of history is still all too primitive. It is possible to study a multitude of histories and yet permit history, the record of the transactions and transformations of human activities, to escape us. Taking history in separate doses of this country and that, we take it as a succession of isolated finalities, each one in due season giving way to another, as supernumeraries succeed one another in a march across the stage. We thus miss the fact of history and also its lesson, the diversity of institutional forms and customs which the same human nature may produce and employ. An infantile logic, now happily expelled from physical science, taught that opium put men to sleep because of its dormitive potency. We follow the same logic in social matters when we believe that war exists because of bellicose instincts, or that a particular economic regime is necessary because of acquisitive and competitive impulses which must find expression. Pugnacity and fear are no more native than are pity and sympathy. The important thing morally is the way these native tendencies interact, for their interaction may give a chemical transformation, not a mechanical combination. Similarly, no social institution stands alone as a product of one dominant force. It is a phenomenon or function of a multitude of social factors in their mutual inhibitions and reinforcements. If we follow an infantile logic,
we shall reduplicate the unity of result
and an assumption of unity of force behind it, as men once did with natural events employing teleology as an exhibition of causal efficiency. We thus take the same social custom twice over, once as an existing fact, and then as an original force which produced the fact, and utter sage platitudes about the unalterable workings of human nature or of race. As we account for war by pugnacity, for the capitalistic system by the necessity of an incentive of gain
to stir ambition and effort,
so we account for Greece by power of aesthetic observation, Rome by administrative ability, the Middle Ages by interest in religion, and so on. We have constructed an elaborate political zoology, as mythological and not nearly as poetic as the other zoology of phoenixes, griffins, and unicorns. Native racial spirit, the spirit of the people or of the time, national destiny are familiar figures in this social zoo. As names for effects, for existing customs, they are sometimes useful. As names for explanatory forces, they work havoc with intelligence. An immense debt is due William James for the mere title of his essay, The Moral Equivalence of War. It reveals with a flash of light the true psychology. Clans, tribes, races, cities, empires, nations, states have made war. The argument that this fact proves an ineradicable belligerent instinct which makes war forever inevitable is much more respectable than many arguments about the immutability of this and that social tradition. For it has the weight of a certain empirical generality back of it. Yet the suggestion of an equivalent for war calls attention to the medley of impulses which are casually bunched together under the caption of belligerent impulse, and it calls attention to the fact that the elements of this medley may be woven together
into many differing types of activity,
some of which may function the native impulses in much better ways than war has ever done. Pugnacity, rivalry, vainglory, love of booty, fear, suspicion, anger, desire for freedom from the conventions and restrictions of peace, love of power and hatred of oppression, opportunity for novel displays, love of home and soil, attachment to one's people and to the altar
and the hearth,
courage, loyalty, opportunity to make a name, money or a career, affection, piety to ancestors and ancestral gods, all of these things and many more make up the warlike force. To suppose there is some one unchanging native force which generates war is as naive as the usual assumption that our enemy is actuated solely by the meaner of the tendencies named, and we only by the nobler. In earlier days, there was something more than a verbal connection between pugnacity and fighting. Anger and fear moved promptly through the fists, But between a loosely organized pugilism and the highly organized warfare of today, there intervenes a long economic, scientific, and political history. Social conditions, rather than an old and unchangeable Adam, have generated wars. The ineradicable impulses that are utilized in them are capable of being drafted into many other channels. The century that has witnessed the triumph of the scientific doctrine of the convertibility of natural energies ought not to balk at the lesser miracle of social equivalences and substitutes. It is likely that if Mr. James had witnessed the World War, he would have modified his mode of treatment. So many new transformations entered into the war that the war seems to prove that though an equivalent has not been found for war, the psychological forces traditionally associated with it have already undergone profound changes. We may take the Iliad as a classic expression of war's traditional psychology, as well as the source of the literary tradition regarding its motives and glories. But where are Helen, Hector, and Achilles in modern warfare? The activities that evoke and incorporate a war are no longer personal love, love of glory, or the soldier's love of his own privately amassed booty, but are of a collective, prosaic, political, and economic nature. Universal conscription, the general mobilization of all agricultural and industrial forces of the folk not engaged in the trenches, the application of every conceivable scientific and mechanical device, the mass movements of soldiery regulated from a common center by a depersonalized general staff. These factors relegate the traditional psychological apparatus of war to a now remote antiquity. The motives once appealed to are out of date. They do not now induce war. They simply are played upon after war has been brought into existence in order to keep the common soldiers keyed up to their task. The more horrible a depersonalized scientific mass war becomes, the more necessary it is to find universal ideal motives to justify it. Love of Helen of Troy has become a burning love for all humanity, and hatred of the foe symbolizes a hatred of all the unrighteousness and injustice and oppression which he embodies. The more prosaic the actual causes, the more necessary it is to find glowingly sublime motives. Such considerations hardly prove that war is to be abolished at some future date, but they destroy that argument for its necessary continuance, which is based on the immutability of specified forces in original human nature. Already, the forces that once caused war have found other outlets for themselves, while new provocations, based on new economic and political conditions, have come into being. War is thus seen to be a function of social institutions, not of what is natively fixed in human constitution. The last great war has not, it must be confessed, made the problem of finding social equivalence simpler and easier. It is now naive to attribute war to specific, isolable human impulses for which separate channels of expression may be found, while the rest of life is left to go on about the same. A general social reorganization is needed, which will redistribute forces, immunize, divert, and nullify. Hinton was doubtless right when he wrote that the only way to abolish war was to make peace heroic. It now appears that the heroic emotions are not anything which may be specialized in a sideline, so that the war impulses may find a sublimation in special practices and occupation. They have to get an outlet in all the tasks of peace. The argument for the abiding necessity of war turns out, accordingly, to have this much value. It makes us wisely suspicious of all cheap and easy equivalences. It convinces us of the folly of striving to eliminate war by agencies which leave the other institutions of society pretty much unchanged. History does not prove the inevitability of war, but it does prove that customs and institutions which organize native powers into certain patterns in politics and economics will also generate the war pattern. The problem of war is difficult because it is serious. It is none other than the wider problem of the effective moralizing or humanizing of native impulses in times of peace. The case of economic institutions is as suggestive as that of war. The present system is indeed much more recent and more local than is the institution of war. But no system has ever as yet existed which did not in some form involve the exploitation of some human beings for the advantage of others. And it is argued that this trait is unassailable because it flows from the inherent immutable qualities of human nature. It is argued, for example, that economic inferiorities and disabilities are incidents of an institution of private property, which flows from an original proprietary instinct. It is contended they spring from a competitive struggle for wealth, which in turn flows from the absolute need of profit as an inducement to industry. The pleas are worth examination for the light they throw upon the place of impulses in organized conduct. No unprejudiced observer will lightly deny the existence of an original tendency to assimilate objects and events to the self, to make them part of the me. We may even admit that the me cannot exist without the mine. The self gets solidity and form through an appropriation of things which identifies them with whatever we call myself. Even a workman in a modern factory where depersonalization is extreme gets to have his machine and is perturbed at a change. Possession shapes and consolidates the I of philosophers. I own, therefore I am, expresses a truer psychology than the Cartesian I think, therefore I am. A man's deeds are imputed to him as their owner, not merely as their creator. That he cannot disown them when the moment of their occurrence passes is the root of responsibility, moral as well as legal. But these same considerations evince the versatility of possessive activity. My worldly goods, my good name, my friends, my honor and shame all depend upon a possessive tendency. The need for appropriation has had to be satisfied, but only a calloused imagination fancies that the institution of private property, as it exists A.D. 1921, is the sole or the indispensable means of its realization. Every gallant life is an experiment in different ways of fulfilling it. It expends itself in predatory aggression, in forming friendships, in seeking fame, in literary creation, in scientific production. In the face of this elasticity, it requires an arrogant ignorance to take the existing complex system of stocks and bonds, of wills and inheritance, a system supported at every point by manifold legal and political arrangements, and treat it as the sole legitimate and baptized child of an instinct of appropriation. Sometimes, even now, a man most accentuates the fact of ownership when he gives something away. use or consumption is the normal end of possession, we can conceive a state of things in which the proprietary impulse
gets full satisfaction
by holding goods as mine in just the same degree in which they were visibly administered for a benefit in which a corporate community shared. Does the case stand otherwise with the other psychological principle appealed to, namely the need of an incentive of personal profit to keep men engaged in useful work? We need not content ourselves with pointing out the elasticity of the idea of gain and possible equivalences for pecuniary gain, and the possibility of a state of affairs in which only those things would be counted personal gains which profit a group. It will advance the discussion if we instead subject to analysis the whole conception of incentive and motive. There is doubtless some sense in saying that every conscious act has an incentive or motive. But this sense is as truistic as that of the not dissimilar saying that every event has a cause. Neither statement throws any light on any particular occurrence. It is at most a maxim which advises us
to search for some other fact with which the one in question may be correlated.
Those who attempt to defend the necessity of existing economic institutions as manifestations of human nature convert this suggestion of a concrete inquiry into a generalized truth, and hence to a definitive falsity. They take the saying to mean that nobody would do anything, or at least anything of use to others, without a prospect of some tangible reward. And beneath this false proposition there is another assumption still more monstrous, namely, that a man exists naturally in a state of rest so that he requires some external force to set him into action. The idea of a thing intrinsically wholly inert, in the sense of absolutely passive, is expelled from physics and has taken refuge in the psychology of current economics. In truth, man acts anyway. He can't help acting. In every fundamental sense, it is false that a man requires a motive to make him do something. To a healthy man, inaction is the greatest of woes. Anyone who observes children knows that while periods of rest are natural, laziness is an acquired vice or virtue. While a man is awake, he will do something, if only to build castles in the air. If we like the form of words, we may say that a man eats only because he is moved by hunger. This statement is nevertheless mere tautology. For what does hunger mean except that one of the things which man does naturally, instinctively, is to search for food, that his activity naturally turns that way? Hunger primarily names an act or active process, not a motive for an act. It is an act if we take it grossly, like a babe's blind hunt for the mother's breast. It is an activity if we take it minutely
as a chemical physiological occurrence.
The whole concept of motives is in truth extra-psychological. It is an outcome of the attempt of men to influence human action, first that of others, then of a man to influence his own behavior. No sensible person thinks of attributing the acts of an animal or an idiot to a motive. We call a biting dog ugly, but we don't look for his motive in biting. If, however, we were able to direct the dog's actions by inducing him to reflect upon his acts, we should at once become interested in the dog's motives for acting as he does, and should endeavor to get him interested in the same subject. It is absurd to ask what influences a man to activity, generally speaking. He is an active being, and that is all there is to be said on that score. But when we want to get him to act in this specific way rather than in that, when we want to direct his activity, that is to say in a specified channel, then the question of motive is pertinent. A motive is then that element in the total complex of a man's activity which, if it can be sufficiently stimulated, will result in an act having specified consequences. And part of the process of intensifying or reducing certain elements in the total activity, and thus regulating actual consequence, is to impute to those elements of a person as his actuating motives. A child naturally grabs food, but he does it in our presence. His manner is socially displeasing, and we attribute to his act, up to this time wholly innocent, the motive of greed or selfishness. Greediness simply means the quality of his act as socially observed and disapproved. But by attributing it to him as his motive for acting in the disapproved way, we induce him to refrain. We analyze his total act and call his attention to an obnoxious element in its outcome. A child with equal spontaneity or thoughtlessness gives way to others. We point out to him with approval that he acted considerately, generously. And this quality of action, when noted and encouraged, becomes a reinforcing stimulus of that factor which will induce similar acts in the future. An element in an act viewed as a tendency to produce such and such consequences is a motive. A motive does not exist prior to an act and produce it. It is an act plus a judgment upon some element of it, the judgment being made in the light of the consequences of the act. At first, as was said, others characterize an act with favorable or condign qualities which they impute to an agent's character. They react in this fashion in order to encourage him in future acts of the same sort, or in order to dissuade him, in short, to build or destroy a habit. This characterization is part of the technique of influencing the development of character and conduct. It is a refinement of the ordinary reactions of praise and blame. After a time and to some extent, a person teaches himself to think of the results of acting in this way or that before he acts. He recalls that if he acts this way or that, some observer, real or imaginary, will attribute to him noble or mean disposition, virtuous or vicious motive. Thus he learns to influence his own conduct. An inchoate activity taken in this forward-looking reference to results, especially results of approbation and condemnation, constitutes a motive. Instead, then, of saying that a man requires a motive in order to induce him to act, we should say that when a man is going to act, he needs to know what he is going to do, what the quality of his act is in terms of consequences to follow. In order to act properly, he needs to view his act as others view it, namely as a manifestation of character or will, which is good or bad, according as it is bent upon specific things which are desirable or obnoxious. There is no call to furnish a man with incentives to activity in general, but there is every need to induce him to guide his own action by an intelligent perception of its results. For in the long run, this is the most effective way of influencing activity to take this desirable direction rather than that objectionable one. A motive, in short, is simply an impulse viewed as a constituent in a habit, a factor in a disposition. In general, its meaning is simple. But in fact, motives are as numerous as our original impulsive activities multiplied by the diversified consequences they produce as they operate under diverse conditions. How then does it come about that current economic psychology has so tremendously oversimplified the situation? Why does it recognize but one type of motive, that which concerns personal gain? Of course, part of the answer is to be found in the natural tendency in all sciences toward a substitution of artificial conceptual simplifications for the tangles of concrete empirical facts. But the significant part of the answer has to do with the social conditions under which work is done, conditions which are such as to put an unnatural emphasis upon the prospect of reward. It exemplifies again our leading proposition that social customs are not direct and necessary consequences of specific impulses, but that social institutions and expectations shape and crystallize impulses into dominant habits. The social peculiarity which explains the emphasis put upon profit as an inducement to productive, serviceable work stands out in high relief in the identification of work with labor. For labor means in economic theory something painful, so onerously disagreeable or costly that every individual avoids it if he can, and engages in it only because of the promise of an overbalancing gain. Thus, the question we are invited to consider is what the social condition is that makes productive work uninteresting and toilsome. Why is the psychology of the industrialist so different from that of inventor, explorer, artist, sportsman, scientific investigator, physician, or teacher? For the latter, we do not assert that activity is such a burdensome sacrifice that it is engaged in only because men are bribed to act by hope of reward, or are coerced by fear of loss. The social conditions under which labor is undertaken have become so uncongenial to human nature that it is not undertaken because of intrinsic meaning. It is carried on under conditions which render it immediately irksome.
The alleged need
of an incentive to stir men out of quiescent inertness is the need of an incentive powerful enough to overcome
contrary stimuli
which proceed from the social conditions. Circumstances of productive service now shear away direct satisfaction from those engaging in it. A real and important fact is thus contained in current economic psychology, but it is a fact about existing industrial conditions and not a fact about native original activity. It is natural for activity to be agreeable. It tends to find fulfillment, and finding an outlet is itself satisfactory, for it marks partial accomplishment. If productive activity has become so inherently unsatisfactory that men have to be artificially induced to engage in it, this fact is ample proof that the conditions under which work is carried on bulk the complex of activities instead of promoting them, irritate and frustrate natural tendencies instead of carrying them forward to fruition. Work then becomes labor, the consequence of some aboriginal curse which forces man to do what he would not do if he could help it, the outcome of some original sin which excluded men from a paradise in which desire was satisfied without industry, compelling him to pay for the means of livelihood with the sweat of his brow. From which it follows, naturally, that paradise regained means the accumulation of investments such that a man can live upon their return without labor. There is, we repeat, too much truth in this picture, but it is not a truth concerning original human nature and activity. It concerns the form human impulses have taken under the influence of a specific social environment. If there are difficulties in the way of social alteration, as there certainly are, they do not lie in an original aversion of human nature to serviceable action, but in the historic conditions which have differentiated the work of the laborer for wage from that of the artist, adventurer, sportsman, soldier, administrator, and speculator.
End of section 3. Human Nature and Conduct by John Dewey, Part 2 of 4, The Place of Impulse in Conduct. Section 4, Impulse and Conflict of Habits. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by William Jones. War and the existing economic regime have not been discussed primarily on their own account. They are crucial cases of the relation existing between original impulse and acquired habit. They are so fraught with evil consequences that anyone who is disposed can heap up criticisms without end. Nevertheless, they persist. This persistence constitutes the case for the conservative who argues that such institutions are rooted in an unalterable human nature. A truer psychology locates the difficulty elsewhere. It shows that the trouble lies in the inertness of established habit. No matter how accidental and irrational the circumstances of its origin, no matter how different the conditions which now exist to those under which the habit was formed, the latter persists until the environment obstinately rejects it. Habits once formed perpetuate themselves by acting unremittingly upon the native stock of activities. They stimulate, inhibit, intensify, weaken, select, concentrate, and organize the latter into their own likeness. They create out of the formless void of impulses a world made in their own image. Man is a creature of habit, not of reason, nor yet of instinct. Recognition of the correct psychology locates the problem, but does not guarantee its solution. Indeed, at first sight it seems to indicate that every attempt to solve the problem and secure fundamental reorganizations is caught in a vicious circle. For the direction of native activity depends upon acquired habits, and yet acquired habits can be modified only by redirection of impulses. Existing institutions impose their stamp, their superscription upon impulse and instinct. They embody the modifications the latter have undergone. How then can we get leverage for changing institutions? How shall impulse exercise that readjusting office which has been claimed for it? Shall we not have to depend in the future, as in the past, upon upheaval and accidents to dislocate customs so as to release impulses to serve as points of departure for new habits? The existing psychology of the industrial worker, for example, is slack, irresponsible, combining a maximum of mechanical routine with a maximum of explosive, unregulated impulsiveness. These things have been bred by the existing economic system, but they exist and are formidable obstacles to social change. We cannot breed in men the desire to get something for as nearly nothing as possible, and in the end not pay the price. We satisfy ourselves cheaply by preaching the charm of productivity, and by blaming the inherent selfishness of human nature, and urging some great moral and religious revival. The evils point, in reality, to the necessity of a change in economic institutions, but meantime they offer serious obstacles to the change. At the same time, the existing economic system has enlisted in behalf of its own perpetuity the managerial and the technological abilities which must serve the cause of the laborer if he is to be emancipated. In the face of these difficulties, other persons seek an equally cheap satisfaction in the thought of universal civil war and revolution. Is there any way out of the vicious circle? In the first place, there are possibilities resident in the education of the young which have never yet been taken advantage of. The idea of universal education is as yet hardly a century old, and it is still much more of an idea than a fact, when we take into account the early age at which it terminates for the mass. Also, thus far schooling has been largely utilized as a convenient tool of the existing nationalistic and economic regimes. Hence, it is easy to point out defects and perversions in every existing school system. It is easy for a critic to ridicule the religious devotion to education which has characterized, for example, the American Republic. It is easy to represent it as zeal without knowledge, fanatical faith apart from understanding. And yet the cold fact of the situation is that the chief means of continuous graded economical improvement and social rectification lies in utilizing the opportunities of educating the young to modify prevailing types of thought and desire. The young are not as yet as subject to the full impact of established customs. Their life of impulsive activity is vivid, flexible, experimenting, and curious. Adults have their habits formed, fixed, at least comparatively. They are the subjects, not to say victims, of an environment in which they can directly change only by a maximum of effort and disturbance. They may not be able to perceive clearly the needed changes, or be willing to pay the price of effecting them. Yet they wish a different life for their generation to come. In order to realize that wish, they may create a special environment whose main function is education. In order that education of the young be efficacious in inducing an improved society, it is not necessary for adults to have formulated a definite ideal of some better state. An educational enterprise conducted in this spirit would probably end merely in substituting one rigidity for another. What is necessary is that habits be formed which are more intelligent, more sensitively percipient, more informed with foresight, and more aware of what they are about, and more direct and sincere, more flexibly responsive than those now current. Then they will meet their own problems and propose their own improvements. Educative development of the young is not the only way in which the life of impulse may be employed to effect social ameliorations, though it is the least expensive and most orderly. No adult environment is all of one piece. The more complex a culture is, the more certain it is to include habits formed on differing, even conflicting patterns. Each custom may be rigid, unintelligent in itself, and yet this rigidity may cause it to wear upon others. The resulting attrition may release impulse for new adventures. The present time is conspicuously a time of such internal frictions and liberations. Social life seems chaotic, unorganized, rather than too fixedly regimented. Political and legal institutions are now inconsistent with the habits that dominate friendly intercourse, science, and art. Different institutions foster antagonistic impulses and form contrary dispositions. If we had to wait upon exhortations and unembodied ideals to effect social alterations, we should indeed wait long. But the conflict of patterns involved in institutions which are inharmonious with one another is already producing great changes. The significant point is not whether modifications shall continue to occur, but whether they shall be characterized chiefly by uneasiness, discontent, and blind antagonistic struggles, or whether intelligent direction may modulate the harshness of conflict and turn the elements of disintegration into a constructive synthesis. At all events, the social situation in advanced countries is such as to impart an air of absurdity to our insistence upon the rigidity of customs. There are plenty of persons to tell us that the real trouble lies in lack of fixity of habit and principle, in departure from immutable standards and structures constituted once for all. We are told that we are suffering from an excess of instinct and from laxity of habit due to surrender to impulse as a law of life. The remedy is said to be to return from contemporary fluidity to the stable and spacious patterns of a classic antiquity that observed law and proportion. For somehow antiquity is always classic. When instability, uncertainty, and erratic change are diffused throughout the situation, why dwell upon the evils of fixed habit and the need of release of impulse as an initiator of reorganizations? Why not rather condemn impulse and exalt habits of referencing order and fixed truth? The question is natural, but the remedy suggested is futile. It is not easy to exaggerate the extent to which we now pass from one kind of a nurture to another as we go from business to church, from science to the newspaper, from business to art, from companionship to politics, and from home to school. An individual is now subjected to many conflicting schemes of education. Hence habits are divided against one another, personality is disrupted, the scheme of conduct is confused and disintegrated. But the remedy lies in the development of a new morale, which can be attained only as released impulses are intelligently employed to form harmonious habits adapted to one another in a new situation. A laxity due to decadence of old habits cannot be corrected by exhortations to restore old habits in their former rigidity. Even though it were abstractly desirable, it is impossible. And it is not desirable because the inflexibility of old habits is precisely the chief cause of their decay and disintegration. Plaintive lamentations at the prevalence of change and abstract appeals for restoration of senile authority are signs of personal feebleness, of inability to cope with change. It is a defense reaction. End of section 4. Human Nature and Conduct by John Dewey, Part 2 of 4, The Place of Impulse in Conduct. Section 5, Classification of Instincts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by William Jones. We may sum up the discussion in a few generalized statements. In the first place, it is unscientific to try to restrict original activities to a definite number of sharply demarcated classes of instincts. And the practical result of this attempt is injurious. To classify is, indeed, as useful as it is natural. The indefinite multitude of particular and changing events is met by the mind with acts of defining, inventorying, and listing, reducing to common heads and tying up in bunches. But these acts, like other intelligent acts, are performed for a purpose, and the accomplishment of purpose is their only justification. Speaking generally, the purpose is to facilitate our dealings with unique individuals and changing events. When we assume that our clefts and bunches represent fixed separations and collections in rerum natura, we obstruct rather than aid our transactions with things. We are guilty of a presumption which nature promptly punishes. We are rendered incompetent to deal effectively with the delicacies and novelties of nature and life. Our thought is hard where facts are mobile, bunched and chunky where events are fluid and dissolving. The tendency to forget the office of distinctions and classifications, and to take them as marking things in themselves, is the current fallacy of scientific specialism. It is one of the conspicuous traits of highbrowism, the essence of false abstractionism. This attitude, which once flourished in physical science, now governs theorizing about human nature. Man has been resolved into a definite collection of primary instincts, which may be numbered, catalogued, and exhaustively described one by one. Theorists differ only, or chiefly, as to their number and ranking. Some say 1, self-love; some 2, egoism and altruism; some 3, greed, fear, and glory; while today writers of a more empirical turn run the numbers up to 50 and 60. But in fact, there are as many specific reactions to differing stimulating conditions as there is time for, and our lists are only classifications for a purpose. One of the great evils of this artificial simplification is its influence upon social science. Complicated provinces of life have been assigned to the jurisdiction of some special instinct or group of instincts, which has reigned despotically with the usual consequences of despotism. Politics has replaced religion as the set of phenomena based upon fear, or, after having been the fruit of a special Aristotelian political faculty, has become the necessary condition of restraining man's self-seeking impulse. All sociological facts are disposed of in a few fat volumes as products of imitation and invention, or of cooperation and conflict. Ethics rest upon sympathy, pity, and benevolence. Economics is the science of phenomena due to one love and one aversion, gain and labor. It is surprising that men can engage in these enterprises without being reminded of their exact similarity to natural science before scientific method was discovered in the 17th century. Just now another simplification is current. All instincts go back to the sexual, so that chercher la femme, under multitudinous symbolic disguises, is the last word of science with respect to the analysis of conduct. Some sophisticated simplifications, which once had great influence, are now chiefly matters of historic moment. Even so, they are instructive. They show how social conditions put a heavy load on certain tendencies, so that in the end an acquired disposition is treated as if it were an original and almost the only original activity. Consider, for example, the burden of casual power placed by Hobbes upon the reaction of fear. To a man living with reasonable security and comfort today, Hobbes' pervasive consciousness of fear seems like the idiosyncrasy of an abnormally timid temperament. But a survey of the conditions of his own time, of the disorders which bred general distrust and antagonism, which led to brutal swashbuckling and disintegrating intrigue, puts the matter on a different footing. The social situation conduced to fearfulness. As an account of the psychology of the natural man, his theory is unsound. As a report of contemporary social conditions, there is much to be said for it. Something of the same sort may be said regarding the emphasis of 18th century moralists upon benevolence as the inclusive moral spring to action, as emphasis represented in the 19th century by Comte's exaltation of altruism. The load was excessive, but it testifies to the growth of a new philanthropic spirit, with the breakdown of feudal barriers and a consequent mingling of persons previously divided, a sense of responsibility for the happiness of others, for the mitigation of misery, grew up. Conditions were not ripe for its translation into political action. Hence the importance attached to the private disposition of voluntary benevolence. If we venture into more ancient history, Plato's threefold division of the human soul into a rational element, a spirited active one, and an appetitive one, aiming at increase of gain, is immensely illuminating. As is well known, Plato said that society is the human soul writ large. In society he found three classes: the philosophic and scientific, the soldier citizenry, and the traders and artisans. Hence the generalization as to the three dominating forces in human nature. Read the other way around, we perceive that trade in his days appealed especially to concupiscence, citizenship to a generous élan of self-forgetting loyalty, and scientific study to a disinterested love of wisdom that seemed to be monopolized by a small, isolated group. The distinctions were not in truth projected from the breast of the natural individual into society, but they were cultivated in classes of individuals by force of social custom and expectation. Now the prestige that once attached to the instinct of self-love has not wholly vanished. The case is still worth examination. In its scientific form, start was taken from an alleged instinct of self-preservation, characteristic of man as well as of other animals. From this seemingly innocuous assumption, a mythological psychology burgeoned. Animals, including men, certainly performed many acts whose consequence is to protect and preserve life. If their acts did not upon the whole have this tendency, neither the individual or the species would long endure. The acts that spring from life also in the main conserve life. Such is the undoubted fact. What does the statement amount to? Simply the truism that life is life, that life is a continuing activity as long as it is life at all. But the self-love school converted the fact that life tends to maintain life into a separate and special force which somehow lies back of life and accounts for its various acts. An animal exhibits in its life activity a multitude of acts of breathing, digesting, secreting, excreting, attack, defense, search for food, etc. A multitude of specific responses to specific stimulations of the environment. But mythology comes in and attributes them all to a nisus for self-preservation. Thence it is but a step to the idea that all conscious acts are prompted by self-love. This premise is then elaborated in ingenious schemes, often amusing when animated by a cynical knowledge of the world, tedious when of a would-be logical nature, to prove that every act of man, including his apparent generosities, is a variation played on the theme of self-interest. The fallacy is obvious. Because an animal cannot live except as it is alive, except that it is as its acts have the result of sustaining life, it is concluded that all its acts are instigated by an impulse to self-preservation. Since all acts affect the well-being of their agent in one way or another, and since when a person becomes reflective, he prefers consequences in the way of weal to those of woe, therefore all his acts are due to self-love. In actual substance, one statement says that life is life, and the other says that a self is a self. One says that special acts are acts of a living creature, and the other that they are acts of a self. In the biological statement, the concrete diversity between the acts of, say, a clam and of a dog are covered up by pointing out that the acts of each tend to self-preservation, ignoring the somewhat important fact that in one case it is the life of a clam and in the other the life of a dog which is continued. In morals, the concrete differences between a Jesus, a Peter, a John, and a Judas are covered up by the wise remark that after all, they are all selves, and all act as selves. In every case, a result or end is treated as an actuating cause. The fallacy consists in transforming the truistic fact of acting as a self to the fiction of acting always for self. Every act, truistically again, tends to a certain fulfillment or satisfaction of some habit which is an undoubted element in the structure of character. Each satisfaction is qualitatively what it is because of the disposition fulfilled in the object attained, treachery or loyalty, mercy or cruelty. But theory comes in and blankets the tremendous diversity in the quality of the satisfactions which are experienced by pointing out that they are all satisfactions. The harm done is then completed by transforming this artificial unity of result into an original love of satisfaction as the force that generates all acts alike. Because a Nero and a Peabody both get satisfaction in acting as they do, it is inferred that the satisfaction of each is the same in quality, and that both were actuated by love of the same objective. In reality, the more we concretely dwell upon the common fact of fulfillment, the more we realize the difference in the kind of selves fulfilled. In pointing out that both the North and the South poles are poles, we do not abolish the difference of North from South. We accentuate it. The explanation of the fallacy is, however, too easy to be convincing. There must have been some material, empirical reason why intelligent men were so easily entrapped by a fairly obvious fallacy. That material error was a belief in the fixity and simplicity of the self, a belief which had been fostered by a school far removed from the one in question, the theologians with the dogma of the unity and ready-made completeness of the soul. We arrive at true conceptions of motivation and interest only by the recognition that selfhood, except as it has encased itself in a shell of routine, is in process of making, and that any self is capable of including within itself a number of inconsistent selves, of unharmonized dispositions. Even a Nero may be capable upon occasion of acts of kindness. It is even conceivable that under certain circumstances he may be appalled by the consequences of cruelty and turn to the fostering of kindlier impulses. A sympathetic person is not immune to harsh arrogances, and he may find himself involved in so much trouble as a consequence of a kindly act that he allows his generous impulses to shrivel, and henceforth governs his conduct by the dictates of the strictest worldly prudence. Inconsistencies and shiftings in character are the commonest things in experience. Only the hold of a traditional conception of the singleness and simplicity of soul and self blinds us to perceiving what they mean, the relative fluidity and diversity of the constituents of selfhood. There is no one ready-made self behind activities. There are complex, unstable, opposing attitudes, habits, impulses, which gradually come to terms with one another and assume a certain consistency of configuration, even though only by means of a distribution of inconsistencies, which keeps them in watertight compartments, giving them separate turns or tricks in action. Many good words get spoiled when the word self is prefixed to them. Words like pity, confidence, sacrifice, control, and love. The reason is not far to seek. The word self infects them with a fixed introversion and isolation. It implies that the act of love or trust or control is turned back upon a self which already is in full existence and in whose behalf the act operates. Pity fulfills and creates a self when it is directed outward, opening the mind to new contacts and perceptions. Pity for self withdraws the mind back into itself, rendering its subject unable to learn from the buffetings of fortune. Sacrifice may enlarge a self by bringing about surrender of acquired possessions to requirements of a new growth. Self-sacrifice means a self-maiming, which asks for a compensatory pay in some later possession or indulgence. Confidence as an outgoing act is directness and courage in meeting the facts of life, trusting them to bring instruction and support to a developing self. Confidence, which terminates in the self, means a smug complacency that renders a person obtuse to instruction by events. Control means a command of resources that enlarges the self. Self-control denotes a self which is contracting, concentrating itself upon its own achievements, hugging them tight, and thereby stopping the growth that comes when the self is generously released. A self-conscious moral athleticism that ends in a disproportionate enlargement of some organ. What makes the difference in each of these cases is the difference between a self taken as something already made and a self still making through action. In the former case, action has to contribute profit or security or consolation to a self. In the latter, impulsive action becomes an adventure in discovery of a self which is possible but as yet unrealized, an experiment in creating a self which shall be more inclusive than the one which exists. The idea that only those impulses have moral validity which aim at the welfare of others or are altruistic is almost as one-sided a doctrine as the dogma of self-love. Yet altruism has one marked superiority. It at least suggests a generosity of outgoing action, a liberation of power as against the closed, pent-in, protected atmosphere of a ready-made ego. The reduction of all impulses to forms of self-love is worth investigation because it gives an opportunity to say something about self as an ongoing process. The doctrine itself is faded, its advocates are belated. The notion is too tame to appeal to a generation that has experienced romanticism and has been intoxicated by imbibing from the streams of power released by the Industrial Revolution. The fashionable unification of today goes by the name of the will to power. In the beginning, this is hardly more than a name for a quality of all activity. Every fulfilled activity terminates in added control of conditions, in an art of administering objects. Execution, satisfaction, realization, and fulfillment are all names for the fact that an activity implies an accomplishment which is possible only by subduing circumstances to serve as an accomplice of achievement. Each impulse or habit is thus a will to its own power. To say this is to clothe a truism in a figure. It says that anger or fear or love or hate is successful when it effects some change outside the organism which measures its force and registers its efficiency. The achieved outcome marks the difference between action and a cooped-up sentiment which is expended upon itself. The eye hungers for light, the ear for sound, the hand for surfaces, the arm for things to reach, throw, and lift, the leg for distance, anger for an enemy to destroy, curiosity for something to shiver and cower before, love for a mate. Each impulse is a demand for an object which will enable it to function. Denied an object in reality, it tends to create one in fancy, as pathology shows. So far, we have no generalized will to power, but only the inherent pressure of every activity for an adequate manifestation. It is not so much a demand for power as search for an opportunity to use the power already existing. If opportunities corresponded to the need, a desire for power would hardly arise. Power would be used and satisfaction would accrue. But impulse is balked. If conditions are right for an educative growth, the snubbed impulse will be sublimated. That is, it will become a contributory factor in some more inclusive and complex activity in which it is reduced to a subordinate yet effectual place. Sometimes, however, frustration dams activity up and intensifies it. A longing for satisfaction at any cost is engendered, and when social conditions are such that the path of least resistance lies through subjugation of the energies of others, the will to power bursts into flower. This explains why we attribute a will to power to others, but not to ourselves, except in the complementary sense that being strong, we naturally wish to exercise our strength. Otherwise, for ourselves, we only want what we want when we want it, not being over scrupulous about the means we take to get it. This psychology is naive, but it is truer to facts than the supposition that there exists by itself, as a separate and original thing, a will to power. For it indicates that the real fact is some existing power which demands outlet, and which becomes self-conscious only when it is too weak to overcome obstacles. Conventionally, the will to power is imputed only to a comparatively small number of ambitious and ruthless men. They are probably upon the whole quite unconscious of any such will, being mastered by specific intense impulses that find their realization most readily by bending others to serve as tools of their aims. Self-conscious will to power is found mainly in those who have a so-called inferiority complex, and who would compensate for a sense of personal disadvantage, acquired early in childhood, by making a striking impression upon others, in the reflex of which they feel their strength appreciated. The litterateur who has to take his action out in imagination is much more likely to evince a will to power than a Napoleon who sees definite objects with extraordinary clearness and who makes directly for them. The explosive irritations, naggings, the obstinacy of weak persons, dreams of grandeur, the violence of those usually submissive, are the ordinary marks of a will to power. Discussion of the false simplification involved in this doctrine suggests another unduly fixed and limited classification. Critics of the existing economic regime have divided instincts into the creative and the acquisitive, and have condemned the present order because it embodies the latter at the expense of the former. The division is convenient, yet mistaken. Convenient because it sums up certain facts of the present system, mistaken because it takes social products for psychological originals. Speaking roughly, we may say that native activity is both creative and acquisitive, creative as a process, acquisitive in that it terminates as a rule in some tangible product which brings the process to consciousness of itself. Activity is creative insofar as it moves to its own enrichment as activity, that is, bringing along with itself a release of further activities. Scientific inquiry, artistic production, social companionship possess this trait to a marked degree. Some amount of it is a normal accompaniment of all successfully coordinated action. While from the standpoint of what precedes it is a fulfillment, it is a liberative expansion with respect to what comes after. There is here no antagonism between creative expression and the production of results which endure and which give a sense of accomplishment. Architecture at its best, for example, would probably appear to most persons to be a more creative, not less, than dancing at its best. There is nothing in industrial production which of necessity excludes creative activity. The fact that it terminates intangible utilities no more lowers its status than the uses of a bridge exclude creative art from a share in its design and construction. What requires explanation is why process is so definitely subservient to product in so much of modern industry. That is, why later use rather than present achieving is the emphatic thing. Well, the answer seems to be twofold. An increasingly large portion of economic work is done with machines. As a rule, these machines are not under the personal control of those who operate them. The machines are operated for ends which the worker has no share in forming, and in which, as such, or apart from his wage, he has no interest. He neither understands the machine nor cares for their purpose. He is engaged in an activity in which means are cut off from ends, instruments from what they achieve. Highly mechanized activity tends, as Emerson said, to turn men into spiders and needles. But if men understand what they are about, if they see the whole process of which their special work is a necessary part, and if they have concern, care for the whole, then the mechanizing effect is counteracted. But when a man is only the tender of a machine, he can have no insight and no affection. Creative activity is out of the question. What remains to the workman is, however, not so much acquisitive desires as love of security and a wish for a good time. An excessive premium on security springs from the precarious conditions of the workman. Desire for a good time, so far as it needs any explanation, from demand for relief from drudgery, due to the absence of culturing factors in the work done. Instead of acquisition being a primary end, the net effect of the process is rather to destroy sober care for materials and products, to induce careless wastefulness, so far as that can be indulged in without lessening the weekly wage. From the standpoint of orthodox economic theory, the most surprising thing about modern industry is the small number of persons who have any effective interest in acquisition of wealth. This disregard for acquisition makes it easier for a few who do want to have the things their own way, and who monopolize what is amassed. If an acquisitive impulse were only more evenly developed, more of a real fact than it is quite possible that things would be better than they are. Even with respect to men who succeed in accumulating wealth, it is a mistake to suppose that acquisitiveness plays with most of them a large role, beyond getting control of the tools of the game. Acquisition is necessary as an outcome, but it arises not from love of accumulation, but from the fact that without a large stock of possessions, one cannot engage effectively in modern business. It is an incident of love of power, of desire to impress fellows, to obtain prestige, to secure influence, to manifest ability, to succeed, in short, under the conditions of the given regime. And if we are to shove a mythological psychology of instincts behind modern economics, we should do better to invent instincts for security, a good time, power, and success than to rely upon an acquisitive instinct. We should have also to give much weight to a particular sporting instinct. Not acquiring dollars, but chasing them, hunting them, is the most important thing. Acquisition has its part in the big game, for even the most devoted sportsman prefers, other things being equal, to bring home the fox's brush. A tangible result is the mark to one's self and to others of success in sport. Instead of dividing sharply an acquisitive impulse manifested in business and a creative instinct displayed in science, art, and social fellowship, we should rather first inquire why it is that so much creative activity is in our day diverted into business, and then ask why it is that opportunity for exercise of the creative capacity in business is now restricted to such a small class, those who have to do with banking, finding a market, and manipulating investments. and finally ask why creative activity is perverted into an over-specialized and frequently inhumane operation. For after all, it is not the bare fact of creation, but its quality that counts. The captains of industry are creative artists of a sort. Industry absorbs an undue share of the creative activity of the present time cannot be denied. To impute to the leaders of industry and commerce simply an acquisitive motive is not merely to lack insight into their conduct, but it is to lose the clue to better conditions. For a more proportionate distribution of creative power between business and other occupations, and a more humane, wider use of it in business, depend upon grasping aright the forces actually at work. Industrial leaders combined interest in making far-reaching plans, large syntheses of conditions based upon study, mastery of refined and complex technical skill, control over natural forces and events, with love of adventure, excitement, and mastery of fellow men. When these interests are reinforced with actual command of all the means of luxury, of display, and procuring admiration from the less fortunate, it is not surprising that creative force is drafted largely into business channels, and that competition for an opportunity to display power becomes brutal. The strategic question, as was said, is to understand how and why political, legal, scientific, and educational conditions of society for the last centuries have stimulated and nourished such a one-sided development of creative activities. To approach the problem from this point of view is much more hopeful, though infinitely more complex intellectually, than the approach which sets out with a fixed dualism between acquisitive and creative impulses. The latter assumes a complete split of higher and lower in the original constitution of man. Were this the case, there would be no organic remedy. The sole appeal would be to sentimental exhortation to men to wean themselves from devotion to the things which are beloved by their lower and material nature. And if the appeal were moderately successful, the social result would be a fixed class division. There would remain a lower class, superciliously looked down upon by the higher, consisting of those in whom the acquisitive instinct remains stronger and who do the necessary work of life, while the higher creative class devotes itself to social intercourse, science, and art. Since the underlying psychology is wrong, the problem and its solution assumes in fact a radically different form. There are an indefinite number of original or instinctive activities which are organized into interests and dispositions according to the situations to which they respond. To increase the creative phase and the humane quality of these activities is an affair of modifying the social conditions which stimulate, select, intensify, weaken, and coordinate native activities. The first step in dealing with it is to increase our detailed scientific knowledge. We need to know exactly the selective and directive force of each social situation, exactly how each tendency is promoted and retarded. Command of the physical environment on a large and deliberate scale did not begin until belief in gross forces and entities was abandoned. Control of physical energies is due to inquiry which establishes specific correlations between minute elements. It will not be otherwise with social control and adjustment. Having the knowledge, we may set hopefully at work upon a course of social invention and experimental engineering. A study of the educative effect, the influence upon habit, of each definite form of human intercourse is prerequisite to effective reform. End of section 5. Human Nature and Conduct by John Dewey, Part 2 of 4, The Place of Impulse in Conduct. Section 6, No Separate Instincts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by William Jones. In spite of what has been said, it will be asserted that there are definite, independent, original instincts which manifest themselves in specific acts in a one-to-one correspondence. Fear, it will be said, is a reality, and so is anger and rivalry, and love of mastery of others, and self-abasement, maternal love, sexual desire, gregariousness, and envy, and each has its own appropriate deed as a result. Of course they are realities. So are suction, rusting of metals, thunder and lightning, and lighter-than-air flying machines. But science and invention did not get on as long as men indulged in the notion of special forces to account for such phenomena. Men tried that road, and it only led them into learned ignorance. They spoke of nature's abhorrence of a vacuum, of a force of combustion, of intrinsic nisus toward this and that, of heaviness and levity as forces. It turned out that these forces were only the phenomena over again, translated from a specific and concrete form, in which they were at least actual, into a generalized form in which they were verbal. They converted a problem into a solution which afforded a simulated satisfaction. Advance in insight and control came only when the mind turned squarely around, after it had dawned upon inquirers that their alleged causal forces were only names which condensed into a duplicate form a variety of complex occurrences. They set about breaking up phenomena into minute detail and searching for correlations, that is, for elements in other gross phenomena which also varied. Correspondence of variations of elements took the place of large and imposing forces. The psychology of behavior is only beginning to undergo similar treatment. It is probable that the vogue of sensation psychology was due to the fact that it seemed to promise a similar detailed treatment of personal phenomena. But as yet, we tend to regard sex, hunger, fear, and even much more complex active interest as if they were lump forces, like the combustion or gravity of old-fashioned physical science. It is not hard to see how the notion of a single and separate tendency grew up in the case of simpler acts like hunger and sex. The paths of motor outlet or discharge are comparatively few and are fairly well defined. Specific bodily organs are conspicuously involved. Hence there is suggested the notion of a correspondingly separate psychic force or impulse. There are two fallacies in this assumption. The first consists in ignoring the fact that no activity, even one that is limited by routine habit, is confined to the channel which is most flagrantly involved in its execution. The whole organism is concerned in every act to some extent and in some fashion, internal organs as well as muscular, those of circulation, secretion, etc., since the total state of the organism is never exactly twice alike, insofar as the phenomena of hunger and sex are never twice in the same fact. The difference may be negligible for some purposes, and yet give the key for the purposes of a psychological analysis which shall terminate in a correct judgment of value. Even physiologically, the context of organic changes accompanying an act of hunger or sex makes the difference between a normal and a morbid phenomenon. In the second place, the environment in which the act takes place is never twice alike. Even when the overt organic discharge is substantially the same, the acts impinge upon a different environment and thus have different consequences. It is thus impossible to regard those differences of objective result as indifferent to the quality of the acts. They are immediately sensed if not clearly perceived, and they are the only components of the meaning of the act. When feelings, dwelling antecedently in the soul, are supposed to be the causes of acts, it was natural to suppose that each psychic element had its own inherent quality, which might be directly read off by introspection. But when we surrender this notion, it becomes evident that the only way of telling what an organic act is like is by the sensed or perceptible changes which it occasions. Some of these will be intra-organic and, as just indicated, they will vary with every act. Others will be external to the organism, and these consequences are more important than the intra-organic ones for determining the quality of the act. For they are consequences in which others are concerned and which evoke reactions of favor and disfavor, as well as cooperative and resisting activities of a more indirect sort. Most so-called self-deception is due to employing immediate organic states as criteria of the value of an act. To say that it feels good or yields direct satisfaction is to say that it gives rise to a comfortable internal state. The judgment based upon this experience may be entirely different from the judgment passed by others upon the basis of its objective or social consequences. As a matter of even the most rudimentary precaution, therefore, every person learns to recognize to some extent the quality of an act on the basis of its consequences in the acts of others. But even without this judgment, the exterior changes produced by an act are immediately sensed, and being associated with the act, become a part of its quality. Even a young child sees a smash of things occasionally by his anger, and the smash may compete with the satisfied feeling of discharged energy as an index of value. A child gives way to what, grossly speaking, we call anger. Its felt or appreciated quality depends in the first place upon the conditions of his organism at the time, and this is never twice alike. In the second place, the act is at once modified by the environment upon which it impinges, so that different consequences are immediately reflected back to the doer. In one case, anger is directed, say, at older and stronger playmates who immediately avenge themselves upon the offender, perhaps cruelly. In another case, it takes effect upon weaker and impotent children, and the reflected, appreciated consequence is one of achievement, victory, power, and a knowledge of the means of having one's own way. The notion that anger still remains a single force is a lazy mythology. Even in the cases of hunger and sex, where the channels of action are fairly demarcated by antecedent conditions or nature, the actual content and feel of hunger and sex are indefinitely varied according to their social contexts. Only when a man is starving is hunger an unqualified natural impulse. As it approaches this limit, it tends to lose, moreover, its psychological distinctiveness and to become a raven of the entire organism. The treatment of sex by psychoanalysts is most instructive, for it flagrantly exhibits both the consequences of artificial simplification and the transformation of social results into psychic causes. Writers, usually male, hold forth on the psychology of women as if they were dealing with a platonic universal entity, although they habitually treat men as individuals, varying with structure and environment. They treat phenomena which are peculiarly symptoms of the civilization of the West at the present time as if they were the necessary effects of fixed native impulses of human nature. Romantic love, as it exists today, with all the varying perturbations it occasions, is as definitely a sign of specific historic conditions as are the big battleships with turbines, internal combustion engines, and electrically driven machines. It would be as sensible to treat the latter as the effects of a single psychic cause as to attribute the phenomena of disturbance and conflict which accompany present sexual relations as manifestations of an original single psychic force or libido. Upon this point, at least, a Marxian simplification is nearer the truth than that of Jung. Again, it is customary to suppose that there is a single instinct of fear, or at most a few well-defined subspecies of it. In reality, when one is afraid, the whole being reacts, and this entire responding organism is never twice the same. In fact, also, Every reaction takes place in a different environment, and its meaning is never twice alike, since the difference in environment makes a difference in consequences. It is only mythology which sets up a single, identical psychic force which causes all the reactions of fear, a force beginning and ending in itself. It is true enough that in all cases we are able to identify certain more or less separable characteristic acts, muscular contractions, withdrawals, evasions, concealments. But in the latter words we have already brought in an environment. Such terms as withdrawal and concealment have no meaning except as attitudes toward objects. There is no such thing as an environment in general. There are specific, changing objects and events. Hence the kind of evasion, or running away, or shrinking up, which takes place is directly correlated with specific surrounding conditions. There is no one fear having diverse manifestations. There are as many qualitatively different fears as there are objects responded to and different consequences sensed and observed. Fear of the dark is different from the fear of publicity, fear of the dentist from fear of ghosts, fear of conspicuous success from fear of humiliation, fear of a bat from fear of a bear. Cowardice, embarrassment, caution, and reverence may all be regarded as forms of fear. They all have certain physical organic acts in common, those of organic shrinkage, gestures of hesitation and retreat, but each is qualitatively unique. Each is what it is in virtue of its total interactions or correlations with other acts and with the environing medium, with consequences. High explosives and the aeroplane have brought into being something new in conduct. There is no error in calling it fear, but there is error, even from a limited clinical standpoint, in permitting the classifying name to blot from view the difference between fear of bombs dropped from the sky and the fears which previously existed. The new fear is just as much and just as little original and native as a child's fear of a stranger. For any activity is original when it first occurs. As conditions are continually changing, new and primitive activities are continually occurring. The traditional psychology of instincts obscures recognition of this fact. It sets up a hard and fast preordained class under which specific acts are subsumed so that their own quality and originality are lost from view. This is why the novelist and dramatist are so much more illuminating as well as more interesting commentators on conduct than the schematizing psychologist. The artist makes perceptible individual responses and thus displays a new phase of human nature evoked in new situations. In putting the case visibly and dramatically, he reveals vital actualities. The scientific systematizer treats each act as merely another sample of some old principle, or as the mechanical combination of elements drawn from a ready-made inventory. When we recognize the diversity of native activities and the varied ways in which they are modified through interactions with one another in response to different conditions, we are able to understand moral phenomena otherwise baffling. In the career of any impulse activity, there are, speaking generally, three possibilities. It may find a surging explosive discharge, blind and unintelligent. It may be sublimated, that is, become a factor coordinated intelligently with others in a continuing course of action. Thus, a gust of anger may, because of its dynamic incorporation into disposition, be converted into an abiding conviction of social injustice to be remedied, and furnish the dynamic to carry the conviction into execution. Or an excitation of sexual attraction may reappear in art or in tranquil domestic attachments and services. Such an outcome represents the normal or desirable function of impulse, in which, to use our previous language, the impulse operates as a pivot or reorganization of habit. Or again, a released impulsive activity may be neither immediately expressed in isolated spasmodic action, nor indirectly employed in an enduring interest. It may be suppressed. Suppression is not annihilation. Psychic energy is no more capable of being abolished than the forms we recognize as physical. If it is neither exploded nor converted, it turns inward to lead a surreptitious, subterranean life. An isolated or spasmodic manifestation is a sign of immaturity, crudity, or savagery. A suppressed activity is the cause of all kinds of intellectual and moral pathology. One form of the resulting pathology constitutes reaction, in the sense in which the historian speaks of reactions. A conventionally familiar instance is the Stuart license after Puritan restraint. A striking modern instance is the orgy of extravagance following upon the enforced economics and hardships of war, the moral letdown after its high-strung exalted idealisms, the deliberate carelessness after an attention too intense and too narrow. Onward manifestation of many normal activities had been suppressed, but activities were not suppressed. They were merely dammed up, awaiting their chance. Now such reactions are simultaneous as well as successive. Resort to artificial stimulation, to alcoholic excess, sexual debauchery, opium, and narcotics are examples. Impulses and interests that are not manifested in the regular course of serviceable activity or in recreation demand and secure a special manifestation. And it is interesting to note that there are two opposite forms. Some phenomena are characteristics of persons engaged in a routine, monotonous life of toil, attended with fatigue and hardship. And others are found in persons who are intellectual and executive, men whose activities are anything but monotonous, but are narrowed through over-specialization. Such men think too much, that is, too much along a particular line. They carry too heavy responsibilities, that is, their offices of service are not adequately shared with others. They seek relief by escaping to a more sociable and easy-going world. The imperative demand for companionship, not satisfied in ordinary activity, is met by convivial indulgence. The other class has recourse to excess because its members have in ordinary occupations next to no opportunity for imagination. They make a foray into a more highly colored world as a substitute for a normal exercise of invention, planning, and judgment. Having no regular responsibilities, they seek to recover an illusion of potency and of social recognition by an artificial exaltation of their submerged and humiliated selves. Hence the love of pleasure, against which moralists issue so many warnings. Not that love of pleasures is in itself in any way demoralizing. Love of the pleasures of cheerfulness, of companionship, is one of the steadying influences in conduct. But pleasure has often become identified with special thrills, excitations, ticklings of sense, stirrings of appetite for the express purpose of enjoying the immediate stimulation irrespective of results. Such pleasures are signs of dissipation, dissoluteness in the literal sense. An activity which is deprived of regular stimulation and normal function is peaked into isolated activity, and the result is division, disassociation. A life of routine and of over-specialization in non-routine lines seeks occasions in which to arouse by abnormal means a feeling of satisfaction without any accompanying objective fulfillment. Hence, as moralists have pointed out, the insatiable character of such appetites. Activities are not really satisfied, that is fulfilled by objects. They continue to seek for gratification in more intensified stimulations. Orgies of pleasure-seeking, varying from saturnalia to mild sprees, result. It does not follow, however, that the sole alternative is satisfaction by means of objectively serviceable action, that is, by action which effects useful changes in the environment. There is an optimistic theory of nature according to which wherever there is natural law, there is also natural harmony. Since men, as well as the world, is included in the scope of natural law, it is inferred that there is a natural harmony between human activities and surroundings, a harmony which is disturbed only when a man indulges in artificial departures from nature. According to this view, all man has to do is to keep his occupations in balance with the energies of the environment, and he will be both happy and efficient. Rest, recuperation, and relief can be found in a proper alternation of forms of useful work. Do the things which surroundings indicate need doing, and success, content, restoration of powers will take care of themselves. This benevolent view of nature falls in with a puritanic devotion to work for its own sake, and creates distrust of amusement, play, and recreation. They are felt to be unnecessary, and worse, dangerous diversions from the path of useful action, which is also the path of duty. Social conditions certainly impart to occupations, as they are now carried on, an undue element of fatigue, strain, and drudgery. Consequently, useful occupations, which are so ordered socially as to engage thought, feed imagination, and equalize the impact of stress, would surely introduce a tranquility and recreation which are now lacking. But there is good reason to think that even in the best conditions there is enough maladjustment between the necessities of the environment and the activities natural to man, so that constraint and fatigue would always accompany activity, and special forms of actions be needed, forms that are significantly called recreation. Hence the immense moral importance of play and of fine or make-believe art, of activity that is, which is make-believe from the standpoint of the useful arts, enforced by the demands of the environment. When moralists have not regarded play and art with a censorious eye, they often have thought themselves carrying matters to the pitch of generosity by conceding that they may be morally indifferent or innocent. But in truth, they are moral necessities. They are required to take care of the margin that exists between the total stock of impulses that demand outlet and the amount expended in regular action. They keep the balance which work cannot indefinitely maintain. They are required to introduce variety, flexibility, and sensitiveness into disposition. Yet upon the whole, the humanizing capabilities of sport in its varied forms, drama, fiction, music, poetry, and newspapers, have been neglected. They have been left in a kind of a moral no man's territory. They have accomplished part of their function, but they have not done what they are capable of doing. In many cases they have operated merely as reactions, like those artificial and isolated stimulations already mentioned. The suggestion that play and art have an indispensable moral function which should receive an attention now denied calls out an immediate and vehement protest. We omit reference to that which proceeds from professional moralists to whom art, fun, and sport are habitually under suspicion. For those interested in art, professional estheticians will protest even more strenuously. They at once imagine that some kind of organized supervision, if not censorship, of play, drama, and fiction is contemplated, which will convert them into means of moral edification. If they do not think of Comstockian interference in the alleged interest of public morals, they at least think that what is intended is the elimination by persons of a puritanic, unartistic temperament of everything not found sufficiently earnest and elevating, a fostering of art not for its own sake, but as a means of doing good by something to somebody. There is a natural fear of injecting into art a spirit of earnest uplift, of surrendering art to the reformers. But something quite other than this is meant. Relief from continuous moral activity, in the conventional sense of moral, is itself a moral necessity. The service of art and play is to engage and release impulses in ways quite different from those in which they are occupied and employed in ordinary activities. Their function is to forestall and remedy the usual exaggerations and deficits of activity, even of moral activity, and to prevent a stereotyping of attention. To say that society is altogether too careless about the moral worth of art is not to say that carelessness about useful occupations is not a necessity for art. On the contrary, whatever deprives play and art of their own careless rapture, thereby deprives them of their moral function. Art then becomes poorer as art, as a matter of course, but it also becomes in the same measure less effectual in its pertinent moral office. It tries to do what other things can do better, and it fails to do what nothing but itself can do for human nature, softening rigidities, relaxing strains, allaying bitterness, dispelling moroseness, and breaking down the narrowness consequent upon specialized tasks. Even if the matter be put in this negative way, the moral value of art cannot be depreciated, but there is a more positive function. Play and art add fresh and deeper meanings to the usual activities of life. In contrast with a Philistine relegation of the arts to a trivial byplay from serious concerns, it is truer to say that most of the significance now found in serious occupations originated in activities not immediately useful, and gradually found its way from them into objectively serviceable employments. For their spontaneity and liberation from external necessities permits to them an enhancement and vitality of meaning not possible in preoccupation with immediate needs. Later, this meaning is transferred to useful activities and becomes a part of their ordinary working. In saying, then, that art and play have a moral office not adequately taken advantage of, it is asserted that they are responsible to life, to the enriching and freeing of its meanings, not that they are responsible to a moral code, commandment, or special task. To a coarse view, and professed moral refinement is often given to taking coarse views, there is something vulgar not only in recourse to abnormal artificial exigence and stimulations, but also in interest in useless games and arts. Negatively, the two things have features which are alike. They both spring from failure of regular occupations to engage the full scope of impulses and instincts in an elastically balanced way. They both evince a surplusage of imagination over fact, a demand in imaginative activity for an outlet which is denied in overt activity. They both aim at reducing the domination of the prosaic. Both are protests against the lowering of meanings attendant upon ordinary vocations. As a consequence, no rule can be laid down for discriminating by direct inspection between unwholesome stimulations and invaluable excursions into appreciative enhancements of life. Their difference lies in the way they work, the careers to which they commit us. Art releases energy and focuses and tranquilizes it. It releases energy in constructive forms. Castles in the air, like art, have their source in a turning of impulse away from useful production. Both are due to the failure in some part of man's constitution to secure fulfillment in ordinary ways. But in one case, the conversion of direct energy into imagination is the starting point of an activity which shapes material. Fancy is fed upon a stuff of life which assumes under its influence a rejuvenated, composed, and enhanced form. In the other case, fancy remains an end in itself. It becomes an indulging in fantasies which bring about withdrawal from all realities, while wishes impotent in action build a world which yields temporary excitement. Any imagination is a sign that impulse is impeded and is groping for utterance. Sometimes the outcome is a refreshed, useful habit. Sometimes it is an articulation in creative art. And sometimes it is a futile romancing which for some natures does what self-pity does for others. The amount of potential energy of reconstruction that is dissipated in unexpressed fantasy supplies us with a fair measure of the extent to which the current organization of occupation balks and twists impulse, and, by the same sign, with a measure of the function of art which is not yet utilized. The development of mental pathologies to the point where they need clinical attention has of late enforced a widespread consciousness of some of the evils of suppression of impulse. The studies of psychiatrists have made clear that impulses driven into pockets distill poison and produce festering sores. An organization of impulse into a working habit forms an interest. A surreptitious, furtive organization which does not articulate in avowed expression forms a complex. Current clinical psychology has undoubtedly overworked the influence of sexual impulse in this connection, refusing at the hands of some writers to recognize the operation of any other modes of disturbance. There are explanations of this one-sidedness. The intensity of the sexual instinct and its organic ramifications produce many of the cases that are so noticeable as to demand the attention of physicians. And social taboos and the tradition of secrecy have put this impulse under greater strain than has been imposed upon others. If a society existed in which the existence of impulse toward food were socially disavowed until it was controlled to live an illicit, covert life, alienists would have plenty of cases of mental and moral disturbance to relate in connection with hunger. The significant thing is that the pathology arising from the sex instinct affords a striking case of a universal principle. Every impulse is, as far as it goes, force and urgency. It must either be used in some function, directed or sublimated, or be driven into a concealed, hidden activity. It has long been asserted on empirical grounds that expression and enslavement result in corruption and perversion. We have at last discovered the reason for this fact. The wholesome and saving force of intellectual freedom, open confrontation, and publicity now has a stamp of scientific sanction. The evil of checking impulses is not that they are checked. Without inhibition there is no instigation of imagination, no redirection into more discriminated and comprehensive activities. The evil resides in a refusal of direct attention which forces the impulse into disguise and concealment until it enacts its own unavowed, uneasy private life, subject to no inspection and no control. A rebellious disposition is also a form of romanticism. At least rebels set out as romantics, or in popular parlance as idealists. There is no bitterness like that of conscious impotency, the sense of suffocatingly complete suppression. The world is hopeless to one without hope. The rage of total despair is a vain effort at blind destructiveness. Partial suppression induces in some natures a picture of complete freedom, while it arouses a destructive protest against existing institutions as enemies that stand in the way of freedom. Rebellion has at least one advantage over recourse to artificial stimulation and to subconscious nursings of festering sore spots. It engages in action and thereby comes in contact with realities. It contains the possibility of learning something. Yet learning by this method is immensely expensive. The costs are incalculable. As Napoleon said, every revolution moves in a vicious circle. It begins and ends in excess. To view institutions as enemies of freedom and all conventions as slaveries is to deny the only means by which positive freedom in action can be secured. A general liberation of impulses may set things going when they have been stagnant, but if the released forces are on their way to anything, they do not know the way nor where they are going. Indeed, they are bound to be mutually contradictory and hence destructive. Destructive not only of the habits they wish to destroy, but of themselves, of their own efficacy. Convention and custom are necessary to carrying forward impulse to any happy conclusion. A romantic return to nature and a freedom sought within the individual without regard to the existing environment finds its terminus in chaos. Every belief to the contrary combines pessimism regarding the actual with an even more optimistic faith in some natural harmony or another. A faith which is a survival of some of the traditional metaphysics and theologies which professedly are to be swept away. Not convention, but stupid and rigid convention is the foe. And as we have noted, a convention can be reorganized and made mobile only by using some other custom for giving leverage to an impulse. Yet it is too easy to utter commonplaces about the superiority of constructive action to destructive. At all events, the professed conservative and classicist of tradition seeks too cheap a victory over the rebel, for the rebel is not self-generated. In the beginning, no one is a revolutionist simply for the fun of it. However, it may be after the furor of destructive power gets underway. The rebel is the product of extreme fixation and unintelligent immobilities. Life is perpetuated only by renewal. If conditions do not permit renewal to take place continuously, it will take place explosively. The cost of revolutions must be charged up to those who have taken for their aim a rest of custom instead of its readjustment. The only ones who have the right to criticize radicals, adopting for a moment that perversion of language which identifies the radical with the destructive rebel, are those who put as much effort into reconstruction as the rebels are putting into destruction. The primary accusation against the revolutionary must be directed against those who, having power, refuse to use it for ameliorations. They are the ones who accumulate the wrath that sweeps away customs and institutions in an undiscriminating avalanche. Too often, the man who should be criticizing institutions expends his energy in criticizing those who would reform them. What he really objects to is any disturbance of his own vested securities, comforts, and privileged powers. End of section 6. Human Nature and Conduct by John Dewey, Part 2 of 4. The Place of Impulse in Conduct. Section 7. Impulse and Thought. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by William Jones. We return to the original proposition. The proposition of impulse in conduct is intermediary. Morality is an endeavor to find for the manifestation of impulse in special situations an office of refreshment and renewal. The endeavor is not easy of accomplishment. It is easier to surrender the main and public channels of action and belief to the sluggishness of custom in idealized tradition by emotional attachment to its ease, comforts, and privileges, instead of idealizing it in practice by making it more equably balanced with present needs. Again, impulses not used for the work of rejuvenation and vital recovery are sidetracked to find their own lawless barbarities or their own sentimental refinements. Or they are perverted to pathological careers, some of which have been mentioned. In the course of time, custom becomes intolerable because of what it suppresses, and some accident of war or inner catastrophe releases impulses for unrestrained expression. At such times we have philosophies which identify progress with motion, blind spontaneity with freedom, and which, under the name of sacredness of individuality, or a return to the norms of nature, make impulse a law unto itself. The oscillation between impulse arrested and frozen in rigid custom, and impulse isolated and undirected, is seen most conspicuously when epochs of conservatism and revolutionary ardor alternate. But the same phenomenon is repeated on a smaller scale in individuals. And in society, the two tendencies and philosophies exist simultaneously. They waste in controversial strife the energy that is needed for specific criticism and specific reconstruction. The release of some portion of the stock of impulses is an opportunity, not an end. In its origin it is the product of chance, but it affords imagination and invention their chance. The moral correlate of liberated impulse is not immediate activity, but reflection upon the way in which to use impulse to renew disposition and reorganize habit. Escape from the clutch of custom gives an opportunity to do old things in new ways, and thus to construct new ends and means. Breach in the crust of the cake of custom releases impulses, but it is the work of intelligence to find the ways of using them. There is an alternative between anchoring a boat in the harbor till it becomes a rotting hulk, and letting it loose to be the sport of every contrary gust. To discover and define this alternative is the business of mind, of observant, remembering, contriving disposition. Habit as a vital art depends upon the animation of habit by impulse. Only this inspiriting stands between habit and stagnation. But art, little as well as great, anonymous as well as that distinguished by titles of dignity, cannot be improvised. It is impossible without spontaneity, but it is not spontaneity. Impulse is needed to arouse thought, incite reflection, and enliven belief. But only thought notes obstructions, invents tools, conceives aims, directs technique, and thus converts impulse into an art which lives in objects. Thought is born as the twin of impulse in every moment of impeded habit. But unless it is nurtured, it speedily dies, and habit and instinct continue their civil warfare. There is instinctive wisdom in the tendency of the young to ignore the limitations of the environment. Only thus can they discover their own power and learn the differences in different kinds of environing limitations. But this discovery, when once made, marks the birth of intelligence, and with its birth comes the responsibility of the mature to observe, to recall, and to forecast. Every moral life has its radicalism, but this radical factor does not find its full expression in direct action, but in the courage of intelligence to go deeper than either tradition or immediate impulse goes. To the study of intelligence in action we now turn our attention. End of section 7. End of Human Nature and Conduct, Part 2, The Place of Impulse in Conduct, by John Dewey.